Hello. So what I want to talk to you about today is something in physics that we call power. So here goes. So the story that I want to talk about is starts off by talking about charities. So you know that a lot of times when people want to contribute to a charity, to make things a little bit more interesting and get people to contribute to their cause, they'll oftentimes have these events where people do sometimes kind of unusual and crazy things and get people to say that they'll go ahead and they'll commit to donating a certain amount of money uh, for these people, depending on how much they do that event. For example, sometimes like my sons, their school has a fundraiser where the students run laps, and people will pledge. They'll say, "Hey, for every lap that you run, I will donate 25 cents or $1 to your school," and that's how the school raises money as a fundraiser. There's one fundraiser that's been done for a long time downtown Chicago, and it's a fundraiser where they have them go ahead and go and run up the flights of steps in the skyscrapers downtown Chicago. For example, this one it's done every year is called the Hustle Up the Hancock, and actually they just changed the name this year. It says here they dropped the Up the Hancock from our event name for the first time since 2013. So they went ahead and changed that and changed the logo. So what it is people go and they run up all the flights of steps in Hancock Building, and they get people to don't say, "Oh, I'll go ahead and I'll pledge this much money for every floor that you run up," right? In the Hancock Building, and so that's the idea, and it's to benefit the Respiratory Health Association, which goes ahead and educates and tries to get people, and promotes research for these different causes. So that's the idea. So if I were to tell you that I went ahead and I did the Hustle Up the Hancock event, and I got all the way up to the top of the Hancock Building, would you be impressed? And you would say, well, yeah, actually, that's very impressive, Mr. C. You raised a lot of mass, lifting your body up a lot of height. You say that would be impressive to me. Like, oh my gosh, yes, gravitational potential energy. You say, hey, that's mg mgh. And you say, gosh, Mr. C, you moved when you did that a lot of mass, right, up a lot of height. And you said, oh my gosh, that's a lot of energy you had to expend to do that. And so you say, well, gosh, when you did that, you say, yeah, it's a lot of energy. However, what if I told you, yeah, I did that, but when I was doing that, I kind of had to take some rest and some breaks along the way. And actually, I didn't get it done like in any kind of rush. I had to take some naps. I kind of took some. It took me, a couple days to get to the top of the building. Are you as impressed? And you say, well, in a certain extent, you might be a little impressed in my dedication that I would spend a couple of days doing this process. But on the other hand, that's not that impressive. Getting to the top of a skyscraper over the course of a few days. And so you say sometimes it's not just about how much energy you can convert from one type to another or how much energy you can transfer from system to system. It's about how quickly you can transfer that energy. How quickly you transfer energy, that rate of change of energy in the system, that is what we call power. We're going to symbolize power with a capital P. Lowercase p, we're going to use for something else next unit. So I want to be careful that it's a capital P here. So you say, hey, power, what's power? It's how quickly you transfer energy in or out of a system or how quickly you change the energy of a system. So it's the rate of change, how quickly we're changing of energy. Now, I really, really prefer to write this formula like this. We say, hey, power. If I want to talk about how quickly I'm changing energy, that's going to be my change in energy divided by the time that it took to do that change. Change in energy per time. Now, we know that when I talk about changing the energy of the system, be it kinetic or potential, they say, well, you know what that's equal to? That's equal to the total work done on the system. So some people will write this formula as the work divided by the time. But we can talk about a power rating for energy being transformed from one type to another inside the system too. So even though the external work is 0, we need to talk about rate of change, how quickly we're transferring energy from one type to another inside a system. And so I much would rather think about it as energy per time rather than work per time. But traditionally, you usually see it written as work per time. Having said that, I want to show you a kind of a cool little derivation here. One more little thing. So you say, if I want to do work per time, you could say, well, I remember that my formula for work is going to be F dot delta X, right? And divide by the time. And you say, well, if I took delta X over T, displacement divided by time. Wait. Displacement divided by time. Isn't that displacement divided by time? Isn't that just velocity? So this would actually just be the force and dotted with the velocity. And I could use that to calculate my power if I wanted. So that's kind of an alternate formula for power, is force times velocity. Usually I don't calculate it that way. Usually I'd much rather do the change in energy or the change in time. And so I usually just abbreviate it as P is, and I hate using big E for energy because big E is going to be, we're going to use it for something else 2 units from now for electric field strength. So I'm just going to write out, yeah. And you're like, Mr. C, that's what you just wrote above. Yeah, that's because I really do not like using capital E for energy. But yes, so this is going to be my formula. Delta energy over time is my power. Those of you with a calculus background will say, hey, that's an average power rating actually. You say if I really wanted to get that, that's just my P bar. If I wanted to get my actual instantaneous power rating, that would be my dW dt, doing the calculus version. But don't sweat that for now. We will not deal with that this year. Next year, we'll talk more about that. One more thing I should talk about with power, okay, is the fact that power, we should talk about the units this would be in. And so you say, well, gosh, I'm going to calculate power as change in energy over change in time. And so you say, if I figured out my units then now for this, you'd say units. My unit for power then is going to be energy over time. So wouldn't that be in joules over seconds? You say, sure. I talk about how many joules per second, how quickly I'm transferring to this many joules of energy each second get transferred or transformed from one type to another. And you say, but joules per second takes a little bit of time to say, and so we invented another unit for it. And the unit we use for power, a joule of energy transferred each second, that is also called a watt. Okay, so a watt, W-A-T-T, is a joule of energy per second. We abbreviate watts with a capital W. Do you see a potential problem with doing that? You say, well, yeah, some people define power as work over time. And so you say, well, gosh, in the formula for power, I have this W over T, where this W stands for work. And later on, I might calculate some value for power that would be in units of watts. And it could be confusing having 2 W's running around. You see, now I know that you're like, well, there shouldn't be any confusion because this W here, that's a unit abbreviation, right? And this W here, that's a variable, right? And so one's a unit abbreviation, one's a variable. They're going to be used different ways. But just to make absolutely certain, this is something that I just do when I'm handwriting to make my W for watts look a little different than my W for power, right? So that when I have I go ahead and I put serifs at the tops of my W's for watts. You say, hey, what's a serif? Well, that's you ever notice that in some fonts, when you go ahead and you type, right? And you go ahead and you say, hey, I'm going to go ahead and put a serif of these little lines that show up on the ends of letters in some fonts. That's a serif, S-E-R-I-F. Unlike serif, S-E-R-A-P-H, that's something different. That's a category of angel. But anyway, but serifs, So I don't know if you've ever heard of some fonts being sans serif fonts, right? I don't know if you've ever seen that word when you're flipping through tables of fonts. They say sans is, of course, French for without. So that's going to give you fonts that don't have serifs on them. So anyway, that's where that's coming from. But anyway, I like to put serifs on my W for watts to make the W for watt look different than W for work. That's just a tip, something that I find to be helpful. So that's about it, really. So power is something that we use when we talk about transferring energy from one system to another or transforming from one type to another. There is one more thing I want to include here, and that's a little quick discussion of why we use the unit watt for power. And that goes like this. There was this, in history, there was this historical figure named James Watt. And James Watt, one of the things that he is famous for is inventing carbon paper. But another thing that he's famous for is that he invented one of the first really efficient steam engines. Okay. And so James Watt wanted, of course, to market his nice and efficient steam engines, sell these engines to people that needed engines for doing things like pumping water out of mines or lifting heavy objects. You say up until this time, before the Industrial Revolution and these nice steam engines, the way, of course, people had to move things around was through muscle power, either through people pulling on things or horses, perhaps, okay, or oxen. And so when he wanted to sell his engines, he wanted to tell people how cool they were and how much energy they could pump out in how much time, how powerful his engines were. And so the way that he calculated power was he needed to have some way to communicate to people how powerful they were. So he invented a unit called the horsepower. Okay, so a horsepower is going to be equal to 746 watts, about. Okay, and that's a horsepower. And you say, but he invented the unit horsepower. How did that work? Well, he wanted to compare the power of his engines to something people already knew about, which was horses. And so what a horsepower means, that is not the maximum rate at which a horse can pump out energy. What that is that's the average rate. If you had a horse all day long, pulling on objects and tugging things around and moving around, on the average, what's the rate at which it pumps out energy per second? That's a horsepower. Almost. See, James Watt wanted to make sure that when he told people his engines had a certain horsepower, people wouldn't say, when they tested them, say, oh no, you're overestimating how powerful your engines are. You know what I mean? So what he did when he invented the horsepower was he measured how much energy a horse could pump out during the course of a day, average rate, and then he multiplied the value of the horse basically by 1.5. So he overestimates what a horse can do. So he's underestimating when he gives horsepower values to his motors, to his engines, how much power they can do. So no one can blame him of saying his engines are too powerful. He's comparing it to a horse, treating a horse as if the horse could do 1.5 times what it actually can do. So that's him kind of covering himself on that and being a little clever about that. 2 more side comments about James Watt, just because I'm here. And that is, oh, by the way, we'll be using the unit of watts in this class. That's the nice metric unit. It's a joule of energy per second. We won't be using horsepower in this course. You might notice if you ever look at motors that a lot of times we describe them in terms of horsepower, that unit that James Watt invented. But just about everything else we use wattage ratings for. And you may have, of course, noticed watt ratings on light bulbs, but you'll also notice them on just about any electrical device you use. You'll find a watt rating on it somewhere. It'll say, oh, this little transformer on your object, or this, this hair dryer, or this whatever electronic device appliance. Somewhere on it, there'll be a rating in watts. And the reason why is because that's saying how much energy per second that object is converting into heat or light or whatever, or motion or whatever it's doing. And you say, why would I care about the watt rating? Well, 2 things. One, the circuits in your house, they can only handle so much energy per second flowing through the wires before the wires start to overheat and cause problems. And so you have circuit breakers that trip to stop the current flowing if you try to send too much current through the wires to keep them from overheating and causing fires and problems. And so you care about how many watts, how much energy per second you're trying to pump out of that one outlet, right? So that's why they tell you not to plug too many things into one outlet to overheat the wires. The other reason why we care is because the power company, they charge you based on how much energy you take from their electrons they're pushing down the wires. And so when I see my watt rating in joules per second, in a way, that's telling me how much energy per second is flying out of my wallet. And so I care about the watt rating on things. Other things about James Watt, now we're getting to the just out of curiosity sort of thing, and that is James Watt was, you may have heard, of course, I hope in history class at some point you've talked about the history of England. And you talked about at one point that the then King of England, Henry VIII, he was trying to get a divorce from his current wife because he was trying to get a male heir to continue the line of the throne. But anyway, but the point is that he ended up breaking from the Catholic Church and setting up the Church of England, saying, hey, you know what, I'm in charge of the Church of England, or Anglican Church, from here on out. Well, if there were other Protestants in the country who did not belong to the Church of England, who were not Anglicans, then what they called those people, they called them dissenters. You know how if you agree with something, you assent to it? If you disagree, you dissent. So they called these people dissenters. They're Protestants in England that do not belong to the Anglican Church. Well, if you were a dissenter, then you were not allowed to pursue certain jobs and certain professions and certain offices. You weren't allowed to be go into politics. You weren't allowed to go into law. You weren't allowed to become a medical doctor, and so on. And so these dissenters, right, these intelligent people, you see, what they ended up doing was they ended up kind of going to these different sorts of professions that were still open to them. And so what they ended up doing is they ended up starting their own schools because they weren't allowed to teach in the public schools. And so they started their own schools, their own like kind of private schools. And one of the things that they ended up going into big time, besides business and commerce that was still open to them, was they went into engineering because that was something that was still open to them. And so a lot of the great discoveries in science and engineering were made by these dissenters. And James Watt is a prime example. Another prime example of that is going to be Michael Faraday, that we will talk about. I think I mentioned him already, I hope, in passing. If not, we will definitely talk about him when we talk about electric fields. But anyway, so that's part of the story about why all these great engineering inventions were coming about because of these people. But getting back to James Watt, something clever he did in selling his motors was he wants people, of course, to buy his motors from him so he can make profit. But buying a big engine, a big new steam engine from some new inventor, it's some new design you don't know about, would make people a little bit leery. Plus, it's a big investment to buy this big engine. So what clever James Watt does is he says, I tell you what, I will give you my steam engine for free, but what you'll have to do, my new really efficient steam engine, what you'll have to do is just give me half of the fuel savings of it every year. So think about what that does. Over time, he's going to be getting money from these people every year, and over time, it will add up to be more than he would have gotten out of just selling them the engine outright up front. Secondly, the people who are getting the engines, they don't have to put out the money up front. They don't have to have the capital on hand to buy the engine from him. He's just giving it to them. So that means they can afford to buy his engine, and it's going to be saving them money over time. And so they get all the benefit. They're getting benefit too. And so that way he's able to sell his engines and make oodles of boodle on it. So that's James Watt, clever fellow that we invented. That we go ahead and use the metric unit for power. The watt is named after. That's it for this video. Thank you for following along. Oh, by the way, Hustle for Hancock, just out of curiosity, if you're interested in that, Going up the Hancock Building, right? 94 floors this last year. Check out the top time. Going up 94 floors in 10 minutes, 19 seconds. That's dang impressive. And look, the guy was 47 years old that did it too. All right, that's it for today.